Today we're going to be looking at Brazil. We have just finished a section on Mexico, race, and the modern nation. Today we're shifting to South America where we're looking at Brazil, race, and the modern nation. We are going to continue to look at a phenomenon called indigenismo, or indigenism, which was a trend throughout Latin America as nations turned away from their colonial personalities into an image or the desire to create a new image for their modern selves. We'll see this manifest through social, political, and economic means, but particularly, of course, we're honing in on the art and architecture of the period and the way that it reflects and shapes current thought. All right, here we are in the third and final section of this lecture on Brazil, the avant-garde, race, and the modern nation. And I hate teaching this last part. We have looked at the work of Tarsila do Amaral, and now we are going to look at it in detail, and it is very difficult content. Here we have Tarsila on the left. And on the right, we have a painting of her by one of the figures, Fernand Léger, of that futurist movement, who we looked at in the last section. Tarsila herself created the primary inspiration, right, for the poet and philosopher Andrade. And this heterogeneous group of writers and philosophers who created the artistic and intellectual movement that they called the Movimento Anthropophagia, but we're going to call it, right, the anthropophagic movement or the cannibalist movement. She was at the base, her artwork was at the base of all of this, which makes it all the more troubling what we're about to talk through. So Tarsila was born in 1886 into a rural family of coffee plantation owners. And you should hear that in its full weight. We are in 1922, so there are no enslaver plantations in Brazil. That has been abolished for over a century, but her family did enslave people in the past. And those people were forced to work their coffee plantations. Part of the privileged, she studied art first in Sao Paulo and then in Paris with Fernand Léger. And this was honestly pretty spectacular for a farmer's daughter at the time. But again, not just a farmer, right? A large-scale plantation owner. Someone with wealth, someone with clout, someone with power, and clearly a lens of white supremacy to be able to enslave the people that they did. We're going to look at Tarsila through two different self-portraits that she painted. The first one shown here was painted in 1923 during her stay in Paris. A critic at the time who saw it in 1925 described it as a painting of a little country girl dressed by French fashion designers. When we look at the painting, right, we see that reflected. Someone who's both naive and sophisticated. Someone who's both Brazilian and cosmopolitan. Although when Tarsila paints this piece, she's leaning more heavily on the sophisticated and cosmopolitan side of those two dichotomies. This piece, called Red Coat, really depicts herself as a really sophisticated Parisian urban girl wearing something elegant, something red and flashy, something designed by Paul Poiret, famous designer. extremely white, extremely privileged. And now let's look at this. Also painted in 1923. A radically different self-portrait here. Take a minute to look at it because it takes a few seconds for it to come out. The piece is called Caipirinha, which is a very well-known Brazilian drink. She's got it in her hand, that blue hand. Here, this is a very unusual self-portrait, right? It takes on cubist elements where you're seeing things from multiple perspectives all at once. We see this concretely in this window, which is somehow now in the foreground, far in front of the tree that of course would be in front of the house. Her body is lodged in here as if it was part of nature itself, and at the same time it's highly geometricized, right? We've got this very triangular body, which reflects these very circular forms. The face, the skin, it's very different here. You can see in these two the way that Tarsila is struggling with her own background, her desire to appear French and cosmopolitan, and also this longing and understanding that she is part of something different in Brazil. The scene that we're seeing full of greenery, fruit, fertility, liveliness. So Tarsila herself is struggling with who she is, how she wants to portray herself in art. As we've talked about, she will then return to Brazil. She and Andrade will found this magazine, the magazine of anthropophagy, the Cannibalist magazine, and it will hit the artistic stage like nothing else. During that time of her return to Paris, she begins to paint these types of scenes of Brazilian folk culture. We see fairs and fruit markets. We see the people of Brazil in a multitude of skin colors, a multitude of settings, but all very festive, all very alive. There's something folkloric and charming in her pieces, where everyone is allowed to do whatever they like. Everyone can dress in any way they want in these pieces. There's a freedom here, a freedom that she finds different than the life she knew in Paris. She celebrates the small homes, the intimate community neighborhoods of the people of Brazil, the working people of Brazil. Almost as if she's wrestling not only with her past, but the nation's past as well. It's critical to say that this is one of the first times that Black populations, which there are so many Black communities in Brazil, more enslaved people were brought to Brazil than to North America. So many thriving communities, so many people who made their life there after the abolition of slavery. So many people who make Brazil what it is. This is the first time they're appearing in these elite galleries, right? This is the first time they are appearing in paintings on a national stage. So what is it that makes this part so troubling? We're getting there, and I know you can feel it already. This is one of Tarsila's known paintings on the left. You can see the influence of Fernand Léger and the Europeans on the right. They're doing their futurist manifesto, action, industry, making, industrialization in the image of the right. And Tarsila does that in her own way, showing the image of progress, modernity in Brazil. Through those telephone lines, the railway lines, all of the industrialization that's shown here across the countryside. All right, take a deep breath. Here we go. This is one of the most famous and impactful and deeply problematic images that I'm about to show you. And I really need your help to think through how and why we teach about Tarsila. So take a minute. In this painting, Tarsila is portraying a woman she was incredibly fond of. It was her nanny as she grew up, someone she adored, someone she considered a parent. At the same time, you just cannot get past the exaggeration of forms, right? Here we have this woman of color, black Brazilian woman, painted as a nude, exposed, and in a way shown in all of her power and glory, but that idea is also stolen at the same time by the characterization of those lips and the face, this small head with features that go outside its boundaries. This painting is shown in so many classes that talk about Brazil and the avant-garde because it was formative. It was a shock. Again, this is really the very first image of black Brazilians that was shown in a gallery. And what Tarsila is trying to do is say the image of Brazil is not white. It's not all those things you're putting in that 1922 catalog. It's not all those things you're putting in that centennial celebration. It is, in fact, people like my nanny, people like this woman. This is Brazil. And in a way, there is strength and power there, and in a way, because it's painted by a white woman, Tarsila is a white descendant of the Portuguese. What we're dealing with is cultural appropriation at the same time. It's so complex, this work. Part of what Tarsila is working against is this image on the left. This image, we talked about this in the section on Kahlo. This nude who just happens to be glowingly naked in the wilderness, standing there waiting to be beheld by men, right? She's on a half shelf, for God's sake. It's ridiculous. You can see she's not looking at the viewer. She's downcast. She's showing some sort of image of modesty, as if she's just been caught naked. This is the history of painting women in Europe that we just discussed when we talked about Frida and Guisola and Gentileschi. This painting from 1485 is one of the most famous examples of that. And in contrast to that, Tarsila is saying, nope, we are not that Italian painting. We are this Brazilian woman. But what do you think? What comes up for you when you see it? Strength, power, a reconfiguration, a realignment of who the Brazilians are, truly? Not this white and European image? Or is it one more instance of a group of white European descendants who form the Portuguese Brazilian avant-garde, appropriating images of Black, indigenous people of color in order to claim something new, something inventive, something that isn't actually theirs? All those questions are in this painting, and I look forward to hearing what you think about this difficult section of material. Well, let's end with Coco Fusco, right? What we want to think about is the fact that Western notions of civilization and culture are fundamentally based in a colonialist project. Tarsila's work could be said to be fundamentally based in a colonialist project, colonizing the strength of the people of color and using it for their own aims. The notion of the primitive other has been essential to maintain this notion of civilization. The two are these intertwined binaries that absolutely need to be broken and shattered, and we see that happening in today's Black Lives Matter movement. And then we need to recognize on some level that capitalism is also based on this differentiation. You may or may not agree with that. You should take my Art 105 class, take my architecture history class, where we look at some of the ways that this is true. And I'll end on this note with Coco Fusco's quote. Our experiences in the cage suggested that even though the idea that America is a colonial system is met with resistance, since it contradicts the dominant ideology's presentation of our system as a democracy, the audience reactions indicated that colonialist roles have been internalized quite effectively. This is something so many of you noted in your work this past week. All right, I look forward to your thoughts. See you next week.